Welcome to Kings Island in Mason, Ohio, near Cincinnati. And here's the entrance. So let's progress through the ticket gates and bring you to the famous entrance. There it is with the scale model recreation of the Eiffel Tower. That's about 300 feet high. And that amazing dancing fountain out front. Kings Island is a legendary park in the coaster enthusiast community, and there are many reasons for that, and we'll explore them as we go through this. Now, there are all sorts of ways of getting around in the park. I'm going to make a sort of clockwise sweep. I'm going to miss a few little sections because there are a lot of little winding paths here and there, but you'll get the general feel of what the park is like. The park celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, and it took the place of a much missed park in Ohio called Coney Island, which was in Cincinnati, and they actually moved a chunk of Coney Island up to Kings Island. They called it Kings Island because it was in Kings Mills, Ohio, and so instead of Coney Island, they call it Kings Island. There's the Kings Island Theater. In front of us is the Drop Tower and also their Sky Coaster. Lots of shade in this park, which is really welcome because it does get very hot here. The theater, you can see these interesting displays out front. The theater was doing a show about the park's Phantom Theater, which was a dark ride, a legendary dark ride they had that I'd ridden many, many years ago. It's a great dark ride, and they had long since replaced it, but to sort of bring nostalgia to the park, they made a theater production of it. This small area doesn't have a lot in it, but there are some important rides. In front of us is Congo Falls, which is the park's big shoot-the-chute ride. The Bat is also back here. The Bat is used to be Top Gun, and it's sort of an homage to the Bat suspended roller coaster that was the first of its kind and only lasted like 2 years because of mechanical problems. So they simply renamed Top Gun the Bat. Similar type of ride, but this one doesn't break down all the time. And you can see some nice pavilions there to get out of the sun and eat food. There was also the Invertigo coaster there. It's basically a giant boomerang where you're suspended. You also can see Delirium, the park's Frisbee ride, and the big coaster there is Banshee, which is a B&M suspended coaster. Similar to Cedar Point, which is another Cedar Fair park, just like this one. This isn't really a theme park. This is a ride park. There are a couple of themed areas in the park, but that's not really what it's about. It's really about a traditional midway like the original Coney Island. The area that we're now in is called the Action Zone, and we're moving into an area called Adventureport, which was new for this year, and I actually love the look of it. It's brightly colored, it looks really festive. It has a lot of sort of Mexican-themed attractions in it, including a really nice Mexican food restaurant. To our right is another very large eatery, almost on the equivalent of the Busch Gardens version. It's called the Festhaus, and it's vaguely German-themed, but it does serve veggie burgers, which were really good, and that's another food option in the park. So here we come up to the Adventureport section. In 1972, Kings Island was mainly financed by the Taft Broadcasting Company, and one of their main properties at the time were the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, so there was a lot of Hanna-Barbera theming in the park. Later, Taft sold the parks to Paramount, and Paramount completely rethemed a lot of the park and added rides that promoted Paramount Pictures. And in 2006, Cedar Fair bought all the Paramount parks, lock, stock, and barrel. So that was Kings Island, Kings Dominion, Canada's Wonderland, and they began building it up to be more like a Cedar Fair park, like Cedar Point. And they've been doing a really nice job. They have a really good sense of visual theming in a park. Not Disney-type theming, but just bringing a sort of life to each area. And you can see all these wonderful bright colors in the Adventureport section. Now, you may have noticed a glimpse off to the right of the Eiffel Tower. That is your landmark in the park. It's one of the tallest structures in the park, and it really helps ground you because it can get really confusing as to where you are. The park basically takes you off in many different directions into very different sections that are hilly and densely forested. So the Eiffel Tower helps you figure out where you go if you want to get back to the center of the park. And you might have seen another coaster off to the left. That was Adventure Express, their mine train. And now we're moving out of the Adventureport section into the Coney Island section of the park, and that was all themed basically to look like a Coney Island Midway. Off to the left here is the Racer. The Racer is legendary in the amusement park business. It was designed by the great John Allen from the Philadelphia Toboggan Company and opened with the park in 1972. And it is visually stunning. It's hard to see it now because so much of the park built up around it. But back then, when it was sort of standing on its own, it had an amazing identifiable profile. Long, lean coaster, racing coaster, that splits at the end into almost a bow tie. And it really is beautiful, all that sinuous wood. And it launched the roller coaster renaissance of the 1970s. It was groundbreaking at the time. And it still provides a wonderful ride. So notice the Coney Island section looks like what you'd expect a regular Midway in an amusement park or a county fair to look like. So we'll continue through this section. And you can see their typical carnival rides. You had a monster over there, you have a scrambler, and typical carnival games over on the left. The park's popularity grew really fast, mainly because Taft Broadcasting was able to leverage its amazing media outlets and do things like do cross promotion. So the Brady Bunch had a famous episode where they went to Kings Island and spent, a day at the park. So Taft did a great job publicizing Kings Island. Now you see the Dodgems, if you go to the right there, it'll take you over to the vintage Philadelphia Toboggan Company carousel that the park has. It's beautiful. And there's also the Tower Gardens, which have a visual walkthrough of the history of the park. It's really interesting. Now we're coming here to a different area, but it's hidden. It's back on the side of the Coney Island area in this little sort of corner. Doesn't fit the theming around here at all. It's called Area 72, and it has a sort of alien outer space theme to it. And there are just two major rides back here, but they are really good rides. One of them is in that big building that you see in front of us as we're walking through here. You can't actually see the roller coaster that's in there. It's hidden, and it has some of the most amazing theming on any coaster. Basically, it's like an alien abduction, and it was originally themed from the Paramount days to the Outer Limits TV show. Now it's just called Flight of Fear, and that big octagonal building back there, that is the actual coaster buried in there. It's a really disorienting ride, all in the dark, but it's really good. I normally don't like looping coasters, but that's one of the few that I enjoy riding. And this thing in front of us is a pretty new ride. That is Orion, a quote-unquote giga coaster, so it's over 300 feet high. And I rode it, and it was okay. It's more of a twister. So normally with a giga coaster, you expect to get a lot of airtime, like Fury 325 at Carowinds. But there's not a lot of airtime on this ride. It's mostly a lot of twisting back and forth. It's crammed into a very small area for a ride over 300 feet high. I would expect them to take up more room for it, to give it more room to breathe. But it is fun. It's comfortable. It's very popular. And in fact, when I rode it, somebody behind me at the end of the ride said, "Wow, that's the smoothest ride in this park." And it was very smooth. Just wasn't quite my cup of tea, as they say. Now, that big red coaster that you see in the distance, that is my cup of tea, and we will talk about that when we get there. That's a great ride. So we'll just mosey on through the rest of the Coney Island section here. There again is the Eiffel Tower for reference. And the Eiffel Tower is an observation tower, so you do go up to almost 300 feet in the air, and you get a beautiful panoramic view of the entire area and the park. It's pretty impressive. You also could get a panoramic view from Windseeker, which is what you see in front of you, that swing ride that goes up really, really high. And notice all the beautiful plantings in the park, really nicely landscaped. And as with almost every park we encountered this year, there were staffing issues. They just couldn't get enough people to work, and so there were many concessions that were closed since they couldn't staff them. In front of you there is the Jukebox Diner, which is very much like Coasters at Cedar Point. You can see the racer in the distance, and in front of us is the Antique Car Ride, which is a very nicely landscaped one. The Spin and Barf ride that you see in front of you now is Shake, Rattle, and Roll, to sort of tie in with the 1950s diner theme. And this section over here is a dead end, but we'll travel down it just so you can see what's in here. There isn't much more than what you can see right now, but you can see Orion in the distance and the turn of the racer. And that's about it, so let's turn around and head back. What surprised me when I created this video was how small the park really is. I expected it to take me a lot longer to get through the park, but it's actually one of the shorter walkthroughs I've done. And that is probably because an enormous amount of real estate in this park is taken up by one coaster, which we'll encounter a little later. So now let's head over toward that big red coaster, and I'll be able to tell you a little more about that one. Well, you'll notice the park seems really empty. It's Tuesday, July 4th, and what we found out later was that usually on July 4th, the park is dead until later on in the day, and people pile in so they can stay in the evening to see the fireworks. Before that, people are at home having cookouts with their family, so they don't come to the park. So it was fortunate for me because it made doing my walkthrough a bit easier. And it also made it better because it was easy to get on the rides. There was almost no wait for the rides. I waited, I think, the most about 20 minutes to get a front seat. So it was good for us. The previous day that we were there, on July 3rd, there was a huge downpour early in the day, and that sort of kept people away as well. This little area here is essentially just an overlook for another roller coaster. Now, this used to be themed to a Paramount movie. Now it's more generic, but it's still called the Stunt Coaster. and it has just sort of generic stunts in it. It doesn't really tie together like the original theming did, but it's still a fun ride. So we're now leaving the Coney Mall section of the park and entering to an area called Rivertown. Now there was another section. I don't really consider it a section because there's really only one thing in it. They have a quote-unquote Oktoberfest section, and the entire section is essentially the Fest House, that one building. That's right next to Adventure Port. But this is a more extensive area. And again, the theming isn't really important here. There's really not much coherence to the theming. It does tend to look more like a Western town as we get deeper into it, but technically this is considered Rivertown, and it doesn't look much like a river town. And stuck up on that hill are some riders who are on Diamondback. And this is an amazing ride. It's sort of my dream coaster. It immediately became my #1 favorite steel coaster when I rode it. There's this little hoop-de-doo here coming out of it, but generally the entire ride is like a huge out and back coaster, so it's just one sustained airtime hill after another, and I love that splashdown ending. It's really neat, and you get a rainbow bonus there. So it's a beautiful ride, and this one does go way far out into the park. But that sustained airtime, you just float out of your seat. I love that. And so this is the coaster for me. And there it goes, over the lift hill. Now this always amazes me. It's the most curious placement for one of the most important roller coasters ever built. You have to follow these little footprints here, these claw marks, to get to the entrance of the Beast, the legendary roller coaster that Kings Island built that still holds the world's record as the longest wooden coaster in the world. It takes up a huge amount of real estate. It goes way out into the forest. It isn't really an airtime coaster. It's more like a high-speed train ride, and like a mine train, and you're just diving all over the place through the woods. It has 2 lift hills, and it has probably the most powerful ending of any coaster ever built. So if you've never ridden it, it's one of those must-ride coasters. It is incredible. I'm not a huge fan of it. I really appreciate its position in history, and I love the ending of the ride. The rest of it, yeah, because for me, I'm an airtime guy. That's what I like. There really is very little airtime on this ride, but there's a lot of speed. Curiously, when I rode it this year, they had lots of trim brakes. So you'd start going down a hill and you'd feel the train pull back. And then you'd go down the hill and you'd come up another hill. You start to go down that hill, you'd feel the train pull back. So they were really trying to slow down the train quite a bit. Now on the left, we just passed by Whitewater Canyon, which is the park's river raft ride. And off in the distance on the left, you could see another roller coaster. This is the second wooden coaster in the park, and it's a fairly recent one. It's Mystic Timbers. And I was really impressed by the ride. I wasn't expecting much because of the supposed big ending that it has, the mystery that they had surrounding it. What is in the shed? And really there isn't much in the shed. And essentially what they did is they created a sort of video show while you're in the brake run, because they have to stack the trains in order to load them. So rather than have you just sit on the brake run doing nothing, they have a little video show that goes on, a little spooky video show. But it was overall, it was a really nice ride. Pretty short, but really good. So that's Mystic Timbers. To the left of Mystic Timbers was the entrance to the park's miniature railroad, which has a really big steam engine. It's a really nice ride. It's called the Kings Island and Miami Railroad, and it does make one stop in Soak City. So if you want to get to the water park, that's one way to do it. Rather than walking, you just take the train there, and then you can come out of Soak City, and it'll drop you back off in Rivertown. And we just passed the Brew House, which is another big eatery, and as you might suspect by the name, they serve beer there. And now we're entering the Kiddyland area of the park. Cedar Fair has a licensing agreement with the Peanuts comic strip, and so they have all sorts of Peanuts theming in their kiddie areas, and this one is called Planet Snoopy. There are also Camp Snoopies. Over there you can see the entrance to Diamondback. And Planet Snoopy has a lot to offer kids, so let's take a look at it. Over on the left is the weirdly named Race for Your Life Charlie Brown. I just don't understand why they called it that. And the theming on it is pretty half-hearted, but it's a Peanuts-themed flume. And it was running later on in the day. Over in front of us is a small suspended roller coaster, very much like the one at Dutch Wonderland, that's made just for kids, so little kids can ride a suspended roller coaster. It's called Flying Ace Aerial Chase. Like Adventureport, this whole area is brightly colored, very appealing to children, and plenty to do. This is like an entire amusement park just for kids within Kings Island. So, a family with small children could easily spend an entire day here with no problem. They even have these little kiddie flying scooters specifically for small children, which I think is really neat. So, things that the big kids can do, little kids can do here as well. And you'll notice that there is a lot of moisture on the midway. And a lot of that is not really caused by the rain we had the other day, but they do have all over the park, as you've seen in other areas, they have misters, which really helps keep people cool in the hot, southern Ohio area. So that's a welcome addition, and they have those everywhere in the park. And there on the left is the Peanuts 500, which is essentially an antique car ride for kids. Over on the right is Woodstock's Whirligigs, which is a sort of monorail for little kids. And then, way over on the left, tucked in the back there, is Woodstock Express, which originally was themed as Scooby-Doo's Ghoster Coaster, and it's a junior Philadelphia Toboggan Company wooden coaster. And it's a really nice ride, and adults can ride it too. As I said before, there are lots of little avenues through here that I'm not exploring, but you're getting the idea that there's a lot to do in this area. All sorts of rides and games and food that kids would really enjoy. So it's a really nice place to spend a day for families with small children. Now up ahead, that used to be the Phantom Theater, and it was switched over during the Paramount days to Scooby-Doo, and now it's called Boo Blasters on Boo Hill, which you'll also find at King's Dominion, the sister park to Kings Island in Virginia. And it's a fun little shooter game, a dark ride. You shoot at these cartoonish little cutouts, and some of the stuff might be a little scary for small children, but generally speaking, it's a good family ride. And now following this path here will bring us back out onto International Plaza, near where we began this entire video. So I hope you've gotten the impression by now that Kings Island is one of the premier amusement parks in the United States. It not only has held its own over the past 50 years, it has thrived, it has grown, and it is even more popular now than it was when it took the place of the original Coney Island back in 1972. And it still retains all of its charm that made it a nostalgic place to be for people from Cincinnati. But at the same time, Cedar Fair has not shied away from bringing it into the 21st century with modern rides that thrill current parkgoers. Now, International Plaza, as you see, has two main sections to it on either side of the fountain. And each section is essentially similar. There are shops where you can buy souvenirs, and they have some wonderful souvenirs here. Or they have food places, little snack places. You have a Cinnabon there. And somebody else in another video that I had made had commented that they're really tired of seeing these chain restaurants begin to infiltrate amusement parks. It was more fun when amusement parks made up their own individual dining areas and had their own personality. And that's true, and I absolutely agree with that. I think for parks, it's just simply a financial decision. It's easier for them to get a chain restaurant to come in and pay for a spot and let them handle all the food production rather than the park doing it. All those areas up above there in the glass on the left, those are all offices. So in conclusion, if you are in the Southern Ohio area, then you have to stop at Kings Island, one of the best amusement parks in the country.